Hello guys, welcome to the video. So as discussed last time, we got started with the OSI model and why we need it. Like when we are trying to learn something new, we should always start with the why of it. Then it's a bit easier to grasp on the later concepts like why do we need it. If we are clear about it, then we have an objective of why are we studying it. So that's why, to set the stage, I made the initial video. Now here I'm planning to dive a bit deeper into the OSI model. Yeah, it looks very fancy with all these jargons and stuff, but basically how to put it, basically it's a like framework for communication, if you may allow for me, like that's a way to say it. Let's forget about this. Let's forget about how two people talk. So when two people talk, one person has to initiate the conversation, right? Suppose let's say hey, then the other person responded with something, then and like hey, how are you? So the other person responded, yeah, I am fine. Then you may respond, yeah, okay, so about this, let's have now let's talk about this. So if you may, there is some context associated with it and someone has to initiate it. Just keep these two things in mind. There needs to be some context when you are like in a free flowing conversation, and there needs to be someone who would initiate it. So yeah, context and initiation, I just write those down for later. Communication requires context and initiation. Okay, yeah. Just writing that down for later because we are gonna use that statement later as well. So I'm just setting up the stage as of now. And then we have, suppose let's add one more layer of complexity here. Let's say you are talking to someone who doesn't speak your language, who speaks some other language. Then you would need a translator. Let's say for the case when you're trying to talk to someone with someone who speaks a different language, you will need one translator, and you will need, like we discussed, some context, and you need to initiate it first of all. I'll just put it on the side for now. Yeah, so let's precede it with a translator. As in, let's say you don't know how to speak French, you need a French translator to talk to someone who speaks French. Yeah, and so on basically. So that's the thing. And let's put you on the top of it. Suppose you are trying to talk to someone. So you're on the top. You need a translator to translate your like whatever you're trying to say, and you need the translator to set the context for the communication so that the whole conversation can take place in the first place. And then yeah, that's the, if you can say that's a and then we have the free flowing conversation as usual. If I can type properly. Yeah, so these are the 4 steps or framework as per se you can consider when you are having a conversation with someone who speaks a different language than you. Let's go through this once again. Suppose you're on the top of it, you need a translator to translate whatever you're saying. You need the translator to set the context for the communication and or initiate it for you, and then we have the free flowing conversation, like whatever you talk about and stuff. And on the end we have like maybe like the context is destroyed, as we can say, like because when you suppose you're done with the conversation, you don't need the context, or like you don't need the context for that conversation anymore because you already have the information that you came for, if that makes sense. So the context is destroyed, or say connection is destroyed, or we can also use the word connection here as well. So this is a basic framework for two people to communicate, like for a successful communication to take place from start to end. So now let's try to translate this to this part of it, like the OSI model that we have here. Let's try to talk about these 3 layers. Assume this is one side of the communication. It will need another side for it to communicate to. That's the very like obvious thing. So let's put it here as well. Okay, I'll just put it below. Ignore this for now. We'll go through this later. And I'll just move out a bit. Yeah. So this is the whole thing. Like if you, yeah. So let's say this is person 1 or maybe device 1. We'll associate as person. Maybe like we're trying to relate it to the real world scenario. So let's call it person 1. And let's call it person 2. Okay, I messed up here. Sorry about that. Yeah, that should do it. So yeah, so we have person 1 and person 2. So person 1 has to initiate the conversation. Let's say person 1 speaks English and person 2 speaks maybe French also. I don't know. Like basically they don't know each other's languages, what they're speaking. Now let's say this person wants to talk to this person regarding like any information that they might wish to have. So what they would do is they would get a translator. First of all, let's assume the application is the person. Okay, let's assume the application is the person who knows English. He would need or he or she or whatever the person is, they would need a translator. That would be the presentation layer. Translator as in okay, yeah, let's keep it simple for now. So he would the person would need a translator who would translate what he's trying to say into a general format. Let's assume for now that like basically this translator wouldn't basically person 1 is trying to talk to person 2. That person would need a translator to translate whatever he's saying to some other language so that this person can understand it. Now let's say this person also has a translator. For whatever this person is saying, to translate that thing to maybe whatever this person can understand. For the sake of this example, let's take one condition. Let's since the OSI model is a global standard, so let's say every translator has their sort of like a universally accepted language which they can translate, and like suppose let's say language X or something, maybe X. Same for this. Basically this translator can translate from X to French, and this translator can translate from English to X, and so on. It will go both ways actually. Yeah, basically both ways. Yeah, they can do either way. So that's the purpose. Basically X is a, let's say, globally accepted language among this group of translators, so that this can be used as an intermediate language for them to communicate. It's not like so one thing you can one easier way to understand this, like let's say this translator knows the language X but doesn't know French, but that's not an issue here because this translator knows X and this translator knows French. So English to X, X to French, and French to this person. So that's like just an extra intermediary layer in between the translators. Then comes the session layer. Just ignore this for now. We'll go through this later, but let's focus on the example in hand as of now. Session layer. So like we discussed, for initiating a conversation, we need someone to initiate the conversation. For a conversation to take place, like the framework we discussed, we need someone to initiate the initiation, and then we need a context or a connection for the conversation to flow through, and then in the end we have the context destroyed. So let's assume in the session layer, like you can see, this is the connection layer. So whenever like this layer is responsible for maintaining the context or the session throughout the conversation, because if if the context won't be there, or if the session won't be there, then you would have to start over every single time. Like whenever you are trying to say something new, there needs to be some context, there needs to be a session, there needs to be a connection. So these layers are responsible for maintaining that connection between two devices, or in our case between two humans, you can say. But we don't need any third party as per se. It happens intuitively, but yeah, mostly. But here, if we are to emulate the same thing, then we would need a layer to maintain that. So it maintains the context or connection as written there. These are the three things that you need to keep in mind. So these are not important as of now. These are important, but as of now, we are just keeping them out of the picture. There will be one layer of extra complexity that comes up if we want to include this, which we'll go on to, but let's clear this out first. So what we are doing is, person 1 is trying to speak to person 2. Person 1 speaks English, person 2 speaks French. So there will be a translator. This translator, every translator in the world knows the language X, let's say, and they have their own specifics from the X. So this person can translate English to X and vice versa, and this person or translator can translate French to X and vice versa. So this person speaks in English to this person would translate it to X, and this session layer is like maybe this thing will initiate the conversation, and they'll be like, like, hello, how are you? So they'll respond with something if they want to talk to them. Like person would respond, yeah, I am fine, how are you? Then maybe something else, and then the free-flowing conversation starts. So that initiation and maintaining the context and everything is done in the session layer. And whenever the conversation is done for, like whenever they're done talking, the context is destroyed. So the session layer is no longer responsible for maintaining the connection or maintaining the context for the conversation. So this is the ideal case if we talk about two persons who are sitting like physically in a very small distance, or they can just approach each other and talk. In that case, this makes sense. Now let's introduce one more layer of complexity here. Let's say let's say the person doesn't live here, and maybe this person is trying to write some letter to this person for whatever reason. Then what you would do for the letter, one thing that comes up is the, like, basically it needs to go from here, and it needs to reach that, it needs to go from the source, it needs to reach the destination. So keep these two words in mind. If we introduce letters, as you may, like, you can introduce anything else as well, no issues. But if we introduce letters, then there needs to be a source and a destination, so that the right person can get whatever this person is trying to say to them. And we already have these two things here, like the context and the translator. Let's assume we already have that. So source and a destination. When these two things comes into play, we have these things that are important. Like basically, let's say the transport layer. Transport layer are basically the protocols, and protocols are mostly like the well-known ones are UDP and TCP, as we all know. But if someone is not aware of them, that's completely okay. That's not an issue. Basically, we're trying to lay down the context for OSI model so that it's better to understand when you like explore it on your own further. But yeah, basically, let's say, how do you write an address? Let's try to do one small exercise. Let's say you're writing an address. If you notice, the specificity of the address is downward flowing, as in house number X is very specific. It's very specific. Landmark is a bit less specific. And then city is a bit more or less specific, if that makes sense. What I mean to say is, if you know the city of a person, it might not be possible for you to locate the person. Same goes for the landmark. If you like know the landmark, there might be, it's a bit specific. It would be a bit easier for you to like find the person maybe, but it's not like the very exact pinpoint sort of a thing. But you have, when you put something like house number or something, then it's very specific. Like it should be near this landmark, and like it's easier to spot this person or yeah, it's easier to find that person as per se. So the level of specificity decreases as we go below when we are writing an address, or as we move ahead from it, if that makes sense. So that's the concept basically which these 3 layers take into consideration. So now we come to this diagram. This is the layer 3. Layer 3 as in the network layer. Okay, yeah, sorry. So this is the layer 3. Layer 3 is in the network layer. So it has IP. So so let's go to the terminologies once. This is the application layer. Application, different language, because you might write your language in, like, you might write your application in any language that you want. It might be in Python, it might be in Java. Like, this is for the this section is somewhat for the people who has worked on applications earlier, and so you might have heard of encoding and serializing. Like, if you ever have you thought, like, when you pass something to a request, you pass it as some object or some JSON and stuff, but it's still perceived in a way that's expected in the other side of it. So that requires the presentation layer to present it in a way, maybe by translating it to a string, or like, mostly it's a string, but basically, let's say for simplicity, it's an expected format that this can be parsed from here, and then we establish the connection here, and it's maintained throughout the conversation, and when it ends, like, connection is closed. So yeah, that's basically the technicalities of it. Then inside here we have the protocol, we package the data and however you want and stuff, basically that. So what we have here is, my bad. Let's remove this for now. Maybe by mistake I said layer 3 as this one, but yeah, sorry. So basically, when we come to transport layer, we have the protocols here, the TCP and UDP. We package the data in a format. Like, let's say this is very specific, as in, like, we package the data in a format, and then it's passed to network layer, where we add another layer of packaging to it, and then it's passed to data link layer, where we add another layer of packaging to it. So this is like 3 layers of packaging, if you can imagine. So here we have the datagram or segment, any data that these protocols share. It's, that's referred as datagram or segment. It's just terminologies. So for UDP is datagram, for TCP is called segments. These handle the port. Port is like something very specific that you can imagine with the house number here. If you compare these 2 scenarios, you can compare port with the house number. So this will have the source port and destination port. Source port, as in, suppose this person wants to talk back. Why do we need a source port, if you may ask? So maybe, like, this person established the connection and sends the first message, and this person wants to respond back. So they would need this person's address to communicate to. So that's why we need the source port, like, where is it coming from and where it's intended to go. So assume this is the house number thing that you mentioned here. It's very specific. And port is used to communicate in an application level. If you have worked with applications earlier, let's say a Node.js app, you will see that it runs on port 3000, it runs on port 3001. So that's very specific to the application, like which applications would it go to, or process or application, whatever you call it. Basically, a device have basically a computer will have open ports or running ports to establish connection from specific use cases, and you need to know the port to transfer that data, whatever data is intended to that port. So let's say that's the house number aspect here. Then we have IP address. That's another layer of packaging. So another layer of packaging, as in, let's say the landmark can be the IP address. It's not very specific. Like, if you are given just the IP address, you might not be able to deliver the data to the intended person or intended destination, but it's somewhat specific than the last one. Like, let's say we can compare it to the city. It's not much specific. That's the basic thing that I want to lay down. So if you see here, the basic concept of specificity a bit is similar to this one. It decreases as we move on from top to bottom for this one. Okay. So one thing that's convenient with the less specific thing is you can eventually assume a graph like this. Basically, suppose you start with a point where you basically one iterative approach, or maybe a converging graph. You can imagine you start from a point, like you have a huge area, it's somewhere there, then you move there, then you narrow it down further, you move there, you narrow it down further until you find the destination that you intended to. So it's useful in that aspect. So same sort of purpose is served by this layer. It has MAC address, source and destination and everything. So yeah, let's say basically that's all about it on a very basic level of understanding. So what you need is, let's say if you want to summarize the whole OSI model in a very simple manner, what you need is one person, one translator for the context of the conversation so that it's maintained true, and 3 layers of packaging. That's all. 3 layers of packaging is in this 3 layers of packaging I'm talking about here. So let's say this person wants to talk to this person. Let's go through the whole communication flow. So let's say person 1 would first tell whatever he wants to say to the translator. Translator would translate it to language X, or serialize it, or encode it, or whatever you want to call it, and then pass it to the session layer. Session layer is responsible for establishing a connection, establishing or maintaining the connection between these two. We would go through that later on, like when we discuss TCP. There is something called TCP handshake and everything. That's for later. Basically, assume that the initiation is done. Now the conversation is going on. So this is somewhat responsible for maintaining the context of the conversation. Then we go to the transport layer. It would package it properly, and then it would push it further, like with the port address, source port, destination port. And then we have network layer here. It would package it. It would add a further layer of packaging on it with a less specific address, and then it would push it to the data link layer. It will again add a further layer of packaging with a less specific address, like we discussed here, house number, landmark, and city. Then it would move to push it to the physical layer, like the outside world, basically electrical signals and stuff. Like it's converted to electrical signals, and it is like pushed on to the destination. So it's consumed by this part of it. Okay, if I can just, let's keep it this way, no issues. So it's consumed by the other part. So first layer of unpackaging is done. Like I said, like when you reach a city, you need to narrow down the whole aspect. Like this is the city that the person lives in, but that's not quite enough for you to find the person. It will be a bit specific than searching in the very larger space than that, but it's not that specific that you'll be able to find the person. So you have to narrow down a bit. So you unpack this layer and you move on to this. So same thing is done here. It's unpacked, it goes to the above layer. Same unpacking is done here. Same unpacking is done here. And basically the same thing goes on like this. And here, let's say this person translates it to X, this person will translate X to French, and it will convey to this person whatever the other person wants to say. So that's a very broad and broad way of understanding TCP. You can understand it by this simple framework of communication, like I said, how it takes place, and you can somewhat associate this whole thing with this. Let's say if you take into consideration the situation where you want to write a letter to someone who lives far, maybe in some other corner of the world, and speaks a different language. So if you take that example and break it down to a very basic bare minimum level of it, you'll somewhat get similar to this framework, and this can be used to understand the whole TCP thing. We will move on to the details of this, whatever this MAC address, source, destination, and everything are, as we discuss these things further, because we'll be diving deep into it. But as of now, I'm just mentioning and introducing the terms so that it's convenient and you can relate. Okay, so we discussed these things here, so I remember seeing them here, so maybe you can associate them properly. But yeah, that should be for the OSI model, I guess, as of now. It turned out to be a very long video, I think 25 minutes almost. Okay, yeah, that should be it, I guess, for now. Let's discuss something new in the next video. Yeah, have a good day. Bye.